Well, hello everyone. My name is Johnny Dark and I am a comedian. And I think it's important that there is a comedian here today because Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, very much enjoyed humor, and he used humor whenever and wherever he could. Which is why for me, a comedian, I've always found it so ironic that the last words ever heard by this rough man from Illinois would have been a joke, and a mighty silly joke at that. It was delivered on stage on Good Friday evening, April 14th of 1865, in Washington, D.C. at Ford's Theater on 10th Street just above E. Yet another comedian and actor, Harry Hawk, playing the part of Asa Trenchard in Laura Keene's production of Our American Cousin, delivers the joke. It comes soon after Helen Truman, playing the part of Augusta, exits the stage in a comedic huff after a row with our hero, to be followed shortly thereafter by her irate and scheming mother, Mrs. Mount Chessington. The country bumpkin, Asa Trenchard, now stands on stage and is all alone, and he is quite amused. He turns to the fourth wall and says, to no one in particular, in soliloquy, "Don't know the manners of good society, huh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal. You sock-dologizing old man-trap." Now that was it. I know out of context that might not sound like a very funny joke, certainly dated. But when you put it in context and you know that these two highly sophisticated English women were trying to swindle this rube out of his huge inheritance, well then it works twofold. Not only is it a fine joke, but it's a terrific comeuppance. Well, you see, this here country boy was not as naive as they thought. Consequently, when Harry Hawk in character delivers this line, it is, in a theatrical term, boffo, and creates a huge burst of laughter from the audience. Great for the playwright Tom Taylor, not so great for the nation. For you see, this eruption from the crowd was known to be coming by the intruder, and he would use this masked guffaw to muffle the sound of his cowardly deed, which was undeniably horrifying and despicable and regrettably successful, plunging an already divided nation stricken with grief after 4 years of bloody conflict into a bitter and highly suspicious mourning period, with a dubious and clumsy reconstruction to follow. And all because of a dissatisfied fellow American who would not listen to the better angels of his nature and wanted to avenge an unwitting South by removing not just the President of the United States, but the Secretary of the State, William Henry Seward, and Vice President Andrew Johnson, who, coincidentally, just happened to be a Southerner. The scene enacted that night in Box 7 and Box 8 at Ford's Theater has forever tarnished a nation with its claim to fame as being the first time ever a president of the United States was assassinated. If only it were the last. Ironically, the last words ever heard by the rough man from Illinois, as spoken by Mr. Lincoln and Mrs. Lincoln, is when Mrs. Lincoln, with her guest Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris just inches away, nestles up to her husband, hugging his arms, whispering, "Ah, my, but what will Miss Harris think of my hanging on to you so?" The president would say, "She won't think anything about it." They were indeed the last words ever spoken by the Lincolns to each other, this occurring a little before 10 p.m. while the play was still early in Act 3. Soon after would come Harry Hawk and his now infamous line, "You sock-dologizing old man-trap." What a line. Sock-dologizing. Is it even a word? Sad to think that a man of such eloquence in writing and speaking should go to his maker after hearing such a silly retort. Sad and ironic, and yet somehow appropriate, and dare I say it, comforting. It probably made him laugh, because Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, very much enjoyed humor, and he used humor whenever and wherever he could, mostly in self-deprecation. Once, when a rival would say, "Abraham Lincoln is two-faced," he would say, "Well, if I were two-faced, I don't think I'll be wearing this one. Another time when he was running for the Senate, he would tell his friend Henry Villard that he really didn't believe he had the wherewithal to be a senator. Although, he would add, my wife is quite confident that someday I shall be the president. Just imagine, he exclaimed, wrapping his long arms around his knees and giving off a roar of laughter, of such a sucker as me as president. In Pigeon Creek, Indiana, when he was chopping wood one day, a woman came riding by on a horse ever so slowly, and she stopped, and she looked at him and she said, my land sakes alive, child. You are the homeliest boy I have ever seen. You are ugly. Young Abraham would say, well, ma'am, there ain't much I can do about that. The woman said, well, you could have stayed at home. Home for the very young Abraham Lincoln would have been a cabin in the Kentucky wilderness where on February 12th of 1809 he was born, just 2 years and 2 days after his sister Sarah. There they resided with their parents, Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks Lincoln, at a place near Knob Creek and Sinking Springs Farm just 3 miles southwest of Hogganville, Kentucky. Their cabin was located right alongside the old Cumberland Trail, where as a boy, the future chief executive could listen to the yarns and the tall tales of the travelers and witness the grimness of slaves being driven south to be sold at auction. The Lincolns were part of a fundamental Baptist group that very much opposed slavery, which might account for Abraham Lincoln's opposition to it as well. He had always said, I have never not been anti-slavery. In 1816, after disputes over the ownership of his land and the death of a third child in infancy, little Thomas Lincoln Jr., the elder Lincoln decided to pack up his family and move to the even deeper wilderness of southern Indiana, Pigeon Creek, Indiana, in Perry County, now Spencer County. And as we are here, they had to actually carve out a path to the land that Thomas Lincoln claimed, and then carve out a piece of that so they might be able to build themselves a home. It was at this time, at the age of 7 years old, that Abraham Lincoln had an axe placed into his hands, seemingly never to be taken out. The clearing of the surplus wood was the great task ahead, and I, though very young, was large for my age and had an axe placed into my hands at once, and from that to within my 23rd year have almost constantly been handling that most useful instrument. Their nearest neighbor was over a mile away. They were alone and they were isolated. And at night, at their half-faced camp, nothing more than a rough shelter with no flooring enclosed on just 3 sides, they would huddle around a fire where they could hear distinctively the menacing sounds of the howling of the wolves, the screams of the panthers, and the foraging of the big bears for food. It was for all concerned unsettling. Despite these hardships, despite these carnivorous critters, the little family went about the business of building themselves a home. And in just a little while, thanks to the kindness of their neighbors and friends, they built themselves a sturdy little cabin. They got by that first year, mostly by hunting, subsisting on bear meat and deer meat. And with even little Abraham Lincoln chipping in a mite right before his 8th birthday in February, when he shot and killed a turkey. But it was something he could never do again. Killing was not for him. I have not since pulled the trigger on any larger game. Life on the prairie was desperately lonely and rugged, but it was worse. It was extremely dangerous. In 1787, Abraham Lincoln's father's father, Abraham Lincoln Sr., a Virginia planter turned Kentucky farmer and a distant relative to the great Daniel Boone, was out in his field planting cord with his 3 sons, Mordecai, Josiah, and Thomas Lincoln, when suddenly they were ambushed by Indians. Abraham Lincoln Sr. was killed right off. Mordecai, the oldest boy at 15, sent his younger brother Josiah running back to the settlement a half a mile away for help as he ran back to the cabin to fetch himself a musket. Once inside the cabin, he could hear through cracks in the log and see that an Indian had come out of the woods and was now creeping up upon his younger brother Thomas, just 6 years old, still sitting and weeping next to the body of his dead father. Mordecai grabbed his musket and on a run cocked it and aimed it directly out a silver pennant on that Indian's chest, fired, and killed him instantly, thus saving the life of Abraham Lincoln's father, Thomas Lincoln. Such was life on the prairie, where all you could expect was the unexpected. And in 1817 to 1818, the unexpected turned out to be, well, that nothing much happened. It was a fairly benign year. To the contrary, actually, when Nancy Hanks Lincoln was even cheered up a mite when her uncle and aunt, Thomas Sparrow and Elizabeth Hanks Sparrow, along with their illegitimate nephew, Dennis Hanks, all moved to within just a few miles of the Lincoln household, even staying in their half-faced camp while their place was being readied. So now, although life on the prairie was desperately lonely and rugged and extremely dangerous, suddenly, with kin nearby, it had become tolerable for a while. But then things hit a sour note. First, Abraham Lincoln had a very serious accident. One of his many chores was to take corn down to Gordon's mill to be ground into meal. On this particular day, because it was late, he took along their old mare and he hitched that old mare up to the arm of a grist mill. And then he gave that mare a few strokes with the whip. Well, that mare buckled and lashed out at him, kicking him into the forehead. He fell to the ground, bleeding and unconscious, and everyone thought he was dead. They called for his father. And after what seemed an interminable time, the boy was finally revived. And although he couldn't speak for several hours, he nevertheless recovered. But it was indeed a harbinger of things to come. In 1818, as the cows grazed upon the poisonous white snake root, a terrible illness known as the milk sick swept into Indiana, into Pigeon Creek, into the Lincoln household. Among the first to die were Nancy Hanks' uncle, Thomas Sparrow, and Elizabeth Hanks Sparrow. Old Tom Lincoln would have to carve out rude coffins in which to bury them both in. Poor Abraham Lincoln and Nancy Hanks Lincoln, she was so sick she didn't even have time to grieve. And after knowing in an arduous struggle that she was dying, she would call her children to her bedside, and she would tell them to be good and kind to your father, to one another, and to the world. And then, on October 5th of 1818, in Pigeon Creek, Indiana, Nancy Hanks Lincoln died. She was 34 years old, leaving behind a grieving husband and her two grieving and devastated children. The young Abraham Lincoln left to deal with a debilitating depression that would haunt him for the rest of his life, bringing him on several occasions, his friends would say, right to the brink of contemplating suicide. Her death, for him, was a wound of the heart that never healed. She was my angel mother, all that I am, or hope ever to be. I owe to her. Thomas Lincoln alone, quite miserable, unable to cope with the rearing of two children, left them in the care of young cousin Dennis Hanks Lincoln, just 20 years old, and he got himself back to Kentucky to seek himself a wife. 6 months later, he returned with Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln, a widow with 3 small children of her own, Matilda, Elizabeth, and John D. Johnson. The new Mrs. Lincoln went right to work cleaning up and organizing the bedraggled little family, ingratiating them amongst each other without the slightest hint of favoritism or jealousy. With her solidarity, benevolence, and genuine common sense, she soon had her household up and running in no time at all. And for this, she received from them all not only their devotion, but their everlasting love and affection. Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln loved all her children, but she would later admit she was partial to Abraham. I have never given him a cross word in all my life. His mind and mine, what little I have, seem to move together in the same channel. Years later, when comparing her son to her stepson, she would say, both were good boys, but I must say now, both being dead, Abraham was the best boy I ever saw, or ever expect to see. All that can be said about his feelings towards her was that no man ever loved a mother more. He called her Mama. Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln may have just saved Abraham Lincoln's life. She got him out of the doldrum, she curbed his fatalism, and she instilled in him self-esteem by encouraging him to learn wherever and whenever he could. All told, the boy only had was 1 year of formal schooling. If you can call Andrew Crawford's Blab School a formal school, that's where children just recite their lessons aloud to their schoolmaster. No, he was self-taught, and he taught himself how to read and to write. And he loved to read. He would say, my best friend is any man that can get me a book I haven't read. And he read everything he can get his hands on. Aesop's Fable, Weems of Life for Washington, Shakespeare, the Bible, the Kentucky Preceptor, Pilgrim's Progress, the Life of Benjamin Franklin, and the Arabian Nights. His cousin Dennis Hanks would say, oh, that Arabian Nights ain't nothing but a pack of lies. Young Abraham would say, mighty fine lies, though. Mighty fine. Those years under Sarah Bush Johnston's tutelage were perhaps the happiest of Abraham Lincoln's life. She called it a happy, joyful boyhood, filled with mirth and glee, nothing sad or nothing a pinched and want. Under Sarah Bush Johnston's roof, Abraham Lincoln grew in mind and spirit head, most definitely in body. 6 feet 4 inches tall, 215 pounds, all arms, all legs, gangly as all get out, and strong. He could whip any man in wrestling, weightlifting, or horseshoes, and he was a sight to behold, a perfect rube, the typical country bumpkin, if you will. And yet, when he spoke, there was an eloquence about him that people listening knew that here, in fact, was a thinker. On January 20th of 1828, the family was dealt yet another blow with the death of Sister Sarah Lincoln in childbed. Abraham Lincoln always blamed her husband, Aaron Grimsby, and his family for not summoning a doctor sooner. The death of Sister Sarah Lincoln in 1828 would cause a huge rift between the two families. It was also the motivating factor behind a practical joke Abraham Lincoln would play on the Grimsby brothers when they were married jointly. He was somehow able to maneuver the brides into the wrong bedchamber. And then he would lampoon the whole incident in an essay entitled The Chronicles of Reuben. But more importantly, the death of Sister Sarah Lincoln in 1828 solidified the fact that now it was time for Abraham Lincoln to think about leaving home. For honestly, he wanted nothing more to do with his father. He wasn't going to be anything like his father. He wasn't going to be a dirt farmer or a carpenter. And in 1828, the same year that Sarah died, an opportunity came his way when local store owner James Gentry offered him $8 a month to take a flatboat loaded with cargo down the Mississippi River to New Orleans with his son, Allen Gentry. Now, this was more like it, and Abraham Lincoln jumped at the chance. And all in all, it turned out to be a mighty fine experience. Although, one night while docked, the little flatboat was boarded by 7 Negroes intent on killing and robbing the boys. And although both boys were hurt in the fracas, they were able to run off these ruffians, get back on that boat and down that river for that 1,200-mile trip to New Orleans. Abraham Lincoln had never seen anything like a big city. He had never seen anything like New Orleans, and he was awestruck, amazed, befuddled. The sights, the sounds, the hubbub. And here again he saw slaves, only this time chained and shackled and sold at auction to the highest bidder. The sight of human beings buying and selling other human beings was a memory that was never quite erased from the mind of Abraham Lincoln and just served to reinforce his already absolute hatred for the institution of slavery. In 1830, at the age of 21, and for the last time, Abraham Lincoln would fulfill his duties to his father and his stepmother by once again helping them move, this time from Spencer County, Indiana, to Macon County, Illinois. He would even help his father load up the wagon, then he drove the oxen, and when they got to Illinois, he helped his father break up the ground, fence off the land, and build the cabin. And then, after an arduous winter, the winter of the deep snow, everyone down sick with fever and ague, finally, Abraham Lincoln left home for good, without ever looking back, rarely to see his father or his stepmother again. I was a strange, friendless, uneducated, penniless boy, a piece of floating driftwood. That driftwood would wind up snagged along the Sangamon River at a new settlement just 2 years old known as New Salem, Illinois. It's here in New Salem where Abraham Lincoln would find his voice, his first calling, and his first love. But before he could find anything, he needed to find himself a job. Luckily or unluckily, he came in contact with an none too scrupulous businessman by the name of Denton Offutt, who offered him $10 a month to take yet another flatboat loaded with cargo down the Mississippi River for New Orleans, this time with his cousin John Hanks and his stepbrother John D. Johnson. And all in all, this also turned out to be a mighty fine experience. And when he got back to New Salem, he was supposed to go right to work for Denton Offutt at a new store, but that wasn't ready to be opened, so he needed to find odd jobs in order to stay alive. He did a little bit of everything: riverboat man, carpenter, farmer, even worked in the still for a while. And then Denton Offutt's store was opened and Abraham Lincoln became his chief clerk. Well, Denton Offutt was mighty impressed with his new clerk, Abraham Lincoln. He would brag on him to his customers about his wit, his intelligence, and storytelling, but mostly he would brag about his physical strength, how his new clerk, Abraham Lincoln, could whip any man at anything at any time. Well, some of these compliments fell on the ears of a group of rowdy toughs who specialized in gander pulling, cockfighting, whiskey drinking, and who on a whim could destroy a man's store just for the fun of it. They were a group of ruffians known as the Clary Grove Boys, and they had suddenly taken an interest in Abraham Lincoln. Oh, not because of his storytelling or wit or intelligence, but they did want to test out his physical strengths. So they challenged him to a duel with their leader, the stalwart Jack Armstrong. Abraham Lincoln wanted nothing to do with the wrestling match, but he didn't want to be deemed a coward either, especially in a new town. So the match was on. And by all accounts, it was indeed a mighty one. How Jack Armstrong had beaten Abraham Lincoln, but by cheating, legging him, as they used to call it. But what really happened, Abraham Lincoln pinned Jack Armstrong to the ground, stood up over his body, and made the offer to take on all comers, just one at a time. The offer was indeed rejected. Not because these boys were afraid of Abraham Lincoln, but because they had actually taken a liking to him, and no one had taken a bigger liking to Abraham Lincoln than their leader, the stalwart Jack Armstrong. And soon, these boys would become some of Mr. Lincoln's most loyal and enthusiastic supporters, as well as some of his very best friends. Hannah Armstrong, Jack's wife, going so far as to even mend the breeches and socks of Abraham Lincoln, and offering him a place to stay whenever he would need it. Years later, and after the death of Jack Armstrong, Abraham Lincoln would repay Hannah Armstrong back by rushing to her side in 1857 in Beards County and Cass County to help defend her son William Duff Armstrong, accused of murdering James Metzger. It seems that Charles Allen, the eyewitness, claimed he saw William Duff Armstrong strike Metzger with a slingshot, which is nothing more than a strap with a piece of metal attached, at 11 p.m. in the night, by the moon. Well, Abraham Lincoln, armed with nothing more than a 1857 almanac, would prove to the jury that that couldn't have happened because by 11 o'clock, according to the almanac, the moon would have already set and been gone and it would have been pitch dark. Proving this to the jury, along with an impassioned plea, he was able to find an acquittal for William Duff Armstrong, thanks to the ever-eternally grateful Hannah Armstrong. In 1831, Abraham Lincoln would meet and befriend a Negro gentleman, a Haitian by the name of William de Flowville. And in their pleasant conversation, Mr. Lincoln would find out that Flowville was actually a barber, looking for money to make his way to Springfield so he could open his barber shop. So Abraham Lincoln took him over to the Rutledge Tavern. He set up a chair, and he had them cut the hair and trim the beards of his friends and neighbors, enabling him to make enough money to make his way to Springfield, where he would indeed open a barbershop. And for the rest of Abraham Lincoln's Springfield life, that's exactly where he would get his haircut, at a place known far and wide as Billy the Barber's. In 1832, just 8 months after arriving in New Salem, Abraham Lincoln was talked into running for the legislature by his dear friend, the Bowline Green, the Justice of the Peace, Dr. John Allen, and James Rutledge, head of the Debating Society. Mr. Lincoln thought this would be a mighty fine idea. So he went out and purchased himself a white shirt, made the rounds of the county and suggesting, "Y'all know me, I'm Abraham Lincoln, and I have been asked to run for the legislature. My politics are short and sweet like the old woman's dance. I believe in better improvements for the Illinois waterways, better schooling for our children, and a low bank interest rates. If elected, I will work hard for the people." On March 9th of 1832, Abraham Lincoln would announce his candidacy in the newspaper, the Sangamon Journal, by a letter of introduction. Every man is said to have his peculiar ambition, Whether it be true or not, I can say for one that I have no other so great as that of being truly esteemed by my fellow men, by rendering myself worthy of their esteem. How far I shall succeed in this endeavor is totally up to the people. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. This has been Johnny Dark and my new show, Johnny Dark's Lincoln. Thank you.